It's the 30th of December, 1993, and the quiet Yorkshire village of Beaconsdale is experiencing a winter's night much like any other. The local pub, the Woolpack, is hosting a Dickensian evening to raise money for a resident's medical bills. Local businessman Frank Tate is visiting the stables owned by his estranged wife in the hopes of rekindling their relationship. An argument in the pub has led to Archie Brooks storming off into the night, followed by his best friend Nick Bates, and up at Emmerdale Farm, Joe Sugden is taking his mother Annie and her husband Len to the airport for a flight to Spain. It's a night no different than the thousands that have gone before it. And then, the sky starts raining fire. By the end of the night, 147 people will be dead, and that quiet village of Beaconsdale will be forever changed. To say that the 1993 plane crash is a defining moment in Emmerdale's history fails to do it proper justice. Not only does it remain the moment which garnered the highest views in the show's history, but it saved a soap that was on the verge of oblivion, setting it on a trajectory that ensured it would find a place among the heavy hitters of the genre, and leaving a legacy which dramatically expanded the scale on which British soaps felt comfortable working. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into Emmerdale's most famous moment. We'll talk about the origins of Emmerdale and the themes which drove the series for the early years. We'll look at where Emmerdale was in the lead up to the plane crash, briefly touching on the history of disasters in soap, and then review the plane crash itself, finishing by summing up the legacy, impact, and controversy of soap's greatest disaster.
So you've come home then?
Aye, Ma. That's it.
For the first 14 years of its life, Emmerdale was defined by the initial vision of its creator. Born in 1922, Kevin Laffan was a writer whose career was based in theatre. He founded his own repertory company in the 1950s with the Everyman Theatre in Reading, serving as its artistic director until 1958, and had a number of well-reviewed plays under his belt, including 1970's It's a 2 foot 6 inches above the ground world, comedy which pulled no punches in its criticism of the Catholic attitude to sex. In the 60s, Laffan began to branch out into television work, producing and writing for shows such as 1963's Bud, 1968's The Best Pair of Legs in the Business, and 1969's Castle Haven, which starred later Coronation Street actor Roy Barraclough. It was to Laffan that ITV turned when they began looking for a writer for a new lunchtime farming serial that they hoped would replicate some of the success enjoyed by Radio 4's The Archers. Laffan had some doubts. As he later recalled, Donald Baverstock, Yorkshire Television's director of programmes, phoned me, and I was asked if I would like to write a farming serial. My first reaction was, no, I wouldn't. I was a playwright at heart, and my agent told me that it would ruin my reputation. People are very funny. They think that if you write a soap, you are going into the gutter. Just a snobbish thing, really. Anyway, in the end, I agreed. I was asked to write a 3-month serial, so I wrote it as a 26-episode play and left the end open so that it could continue. Broadcast on the 16th of October 1972, the first episode of Emmerdale Farm introduces audiences to the family who had come to dominate the soap, the Sugdens. Following the death of Jacob, the family patriarch, the black sheep of the family, Jack, then played by Andrew Burt, returns to find that he has inherited the farm. Much of the drama of these early episodes comes from Jack's strained relationship with the rest of his family, having left some 8 years previously, only to now have full control over the family farm, leaving his siblings Joe, Fraser Hines, and Peggy, Joe Kendall, to question their own security and future. Though Laffan hadn't initially been keen to work on a soap, the premise clearly grew on him, and he did have experience of his own to work with, having spent 6 months as a farm labourer during his teens. Laffan said that, I was intrigued by the idea that farming was a way of life, as opposed to simply a way of earning a living. I was interested in the mental attitude that set the two apart. This difference is clear in those early Emmerdale episodes. The Sugdens have been a farming family for generations. The land is in their blood. Contrast this with Henry Wilkes, played by Arthur Pentelow, and a string of other industrialist business types who either treat the land as an aesthetic or see it purely as a resource to be financially exploited.
But it's a hard living here. And what we eat, we work for.
Grand view, that.
What are you going to do with all this?
Do with it? Nothing. Just live with it. A view like that's worth a few pounds of any man's money.
I actually really like what I've seen of that first early era of Emmerdale Farm. It's slow and gentle and rural. It reminds me a bit of the Darling Buds of May. I think the characters, setting, and premise are well defined enough to be engaging. Actor Freddie Pine, who played Peggy's husband Matt Skilbeck, said that Kevin had said he wanted it to be like a Dickens novel, a year or so and then finish. That's very evident right from the offset. Emmerdale Farm does feel like a televised adaptation of one of those old countryside novels my grandparents used to have. I do sometimes wonder whether its reputation pre-Plane Crash would have been better if it had been a mini-series of 10 or so hour-long episodes, rather than a full soap. There's a feeling among many, even myself for a long while, that nothing happened during these early years. As a 2006 article in The Independent put it, the soap languished for years, unobtrusively and unsensationally documenting rural life, but never setting the networks, rating, or viewers on fire. Strictly speaking, this isn't quite true. As early as 30 episodes in, Emmerdale Farm featured the rape and murder of 18-year-old Sharon Crosthwaite, played by Louise Jameson. In 1973, Peggy died of a brain hemorrhage. 3 years later, her and Matt's twin babies were killed in a car crash. Incidentally, the only reason why this last storyline happened was because the babies who played Sam and Sally were such a pain in the arse on set that eventually the producer had enough and had them killed off. That has nothing to do with anything, I just thought that was really funny. By the time we get to the late 70s and early 80s, however, the claim that Emmerdale Farm was dull begins to have more merit to it. While the earlier episodes had a quaint feel to them that was still largely focused on the Sugdens, by a few years in the charm had subsided. Yes, there were still dramatic standout storylines, and there are things to like. Amos and Mr. Wilkes, Seth, and Alan Turner are all personal standouts for me. But it feels slower, with scenes dragging more than they should, and the pacing lagging somewhat. Though Emmerdale Farm was popular enough to beat Coronation Street in the ratings on occasion, the criticisms were sticking. It doesn't help that the wider soap scene was very competitive around this time. In 1980, Dallas's groundbreaking Who Shot JR storyline aired. Brookside launched in 1982 and was followed in 1985 by EastEnders. While, strictly speaking, Emmerdale Farm isn't as devoid of drama as many tend to remember, those issues were present and were only exacerbated by the strength of the competition. It was clear that changes were needed. As The Independent tells it, in the late 1980s, as EastEnders and Brookside began to change the traditional nature of soaps, ITV decided it was kill or cure. A new production team was installed. The rural storylines were ditched in favour of more dramatic, racy ones, as was the farm from the title. Keith Richardson became executive producer in 1986 and immediately began implementing changes designed to turn Emmerdale Farm into a standard, modern soap. The focus of the soap shifted away from farming to the village of Beaconsdale and its inhabitants. Bigger storylines came with it. Original character and wife of Jack Sugden, now played by Clive Hornby, Pat Sugden died in a car crash. In 1987, Emmerdale Farm got topical with a nuclear energy protest, and in 1988, Sugden family matriarch Annie, played by Sheila Mercier, developed a tranquilizer addiction. Perhaps the most significant addition during this period was the Tates in 1989. Wealthy haulage company owner Frank, Norman Bowler, his ruthless son Chris, Peter Amory, reserved daughter Zoe, Leah Bracknell, and his much younger wife and former secretary, Kim, Claire King. The wealthy Tates were introduced to allow for new storylines and a glimpse at a lifestyle that wouldn't have been possible with the standard village characters. Though it wasn't planned as a modernising move, in 1991 Amos Braley and Henry Wilkes, joint landlords of the Woolpack, left the soap. Both characters epitomise what Emmerdale Farm had meant in their own way. Played by Ronald McGill, Amos and his mutt chops are decidedly old Yorkshire, while Mr. Wilkes, as previously mentioned, was introduced to add to that theme of farming as a way of life, not just a way of business. That both were original characters present from the first episode only adds to the symbolism of their departure. Certainly the most symbolic change introduced during this time was the alteration made to the very name of the show. Demonstrating the move away from the farming aspects of the soap, Emmerdale Farm now became Emmerdale. While Emmerdale from 1986 through 1993 does resemble a modern soap far more than it previously had done, it does so in the thinnest of ways. The pieces are all there, but it still doesn't feel like it's fully made the break. It's a soap with one foot in the future and one foot in the past, meaning that it doesn't really hit either its old demographic or the one that it aspires to. The Tates are a good example of this midpoint. While there are elements that are more modern, Kim's affair, Chris's general scheming, and just the fact that they so clearly contrast with so much of what Emmerdale had been, they've yet to really hit their stride by this point, and would not do so until the mid-90s. Case in point, Kim Tate herself would not become the queen bitch of British soap for some time, despite the fact that, as an attractive gold digger married to a man old enough to be her father, she's kind of tailor-made for it. I mean, she's literally an evil stepmother, but there's a reluctance to fully take advantage of this. The move to the village also hinders Emmerdale. That sense of a tight-knit community that other soaps have is something that Emmerdale has a bit of an uphill battle replicating, largely due to geography. While a street or a square is a fairly small area where characters are in close confines with one another, a village is far bigger. Beaconsdale and its characters are pretty spread out. Again, it has to be said that the soap scene at large was particularly strong at this point. That period, 1986 to 1993, had some really stellar storylines. Bette Lynch's reign as landlady of the Rovers began in 1985. The next year, Alec Gilroy joined her in one of the street's best-loved double acts. In 1987, Hilda Ogden, one of the most popular characters in British television history, left the show. Alan Bradley's torment of the much-loved Rita made him soap's leading villain, and Ken and Deirdre's marriage collapsed after his affair with Wendy Crozier. EastEnders aired in 1985 and made a huge impact, followed the next year with the famous Den and Angie Watts divorce papers scene, and then Den's death in 1989. The Mitchell brothers were introduced in 1990, and, though Sharon-Gate wouldn't have its climax until after the Emmerdale plane crash, the storyline was already in process. Brookside had perhaps its highest regarded storyline, the rape of Sheila Grant, as well as the introduction of long-running character Jimmy Corkill in 1986, and by 1999 is widely considered to have peaked in popularity. The realistic and gritty style of Brookside, a soap which wasn't afraid to tackle difficult social issues, made something like Coronation Street look quaint. When compared to Emmerdale, the difference was staggering. There's an argument to be made that during this period, all three soaps experienced their golden age. Emmerdale is simply left in the dust. I like things about Emmerdale from this period, but some of the stuff its competitors were putting out at this point ranks among the best of the best in terms of British soap storylines. There is simply no contest. It is so jarring to see what Emmerdale was up against. What makes it worse is that this wasn't just a case of one strong rival dominating the field, but of every rival being strong and dominating the field. EastEnders, for example, was not doing particularly well towards the end of the 80s, but Coronation Street was, and when Coronation Street had a weak point in the early 90s, EastEnders was introducing the Mitchell brothers and setting up for Sharon-Gate. So by the time we get to 1993, things were looking really bad for Emmerdale. The changes begun in 86 had only done so much, and the soap was drowning in a field of exceptionally strong competitors. Ratings were falling, and regional networks were beginning to drop the show. It reached the point where ITV issued an ultimatum to Emmerdale executives.
The powers that be read the riot act out to our bosses and said, you're going to have to do something to boost the viewing figures.
There was talk of it being pulled.
Emmerdale was on the verge of oblivion. It needed urgent action, and it needed it fast. Enter Phil Redmond. Described in a 2008 profile piece for The Independent as a blunt and restless man with a genius for controversy, Phil Redmond already had a reputation in British television for challenging established norms and focusing on social realism, two themes that are very evident in his most successful creations up until that point, Grange Hill and Brookside. First airing in 1978, Grange Hill was a children's show that portrayed a very different type of school life from anything that had come before it, featuring drug abuse, bullying, mental health issues, teenage pregnancy, cancer, and alcoholism among its many hard-hitting storylines. Such was Grange Hill's power for controversy that the BBC asked Redmond to tone it down early in the first series, and the show swiftly became a target for vintage Karen, Mary Whitehouse, who claimed that it promoted bad behaviour in schools. The counterpoint to these concerns is that Grange Hill not only represented school life as it really was, but society as it really was. When compared with the other children's shows which existed at the time, which in general were fairly twee, Grange Hill stands out as something far different. Redmond has said that, "I wrote Grange Hill so kids would have something to relate to. We wanted to move away from the Enid Blyton middle-class drama that the BBC had been showing, and portray the realities of school life." In his autobiography, Midterm Report, which I highly recommend by the way, Redmond writes about how Grange Hill as an idea began to be formulated during the second year of his social studies degree. 2 books that were on the syllabus focused on children's education: How Children Fail by John Holt and Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich. The former said that children inherently love learning, but that the school system, with its focus on right answers and scoring, teaches them to hate it, while the latter argued that schools should be removed from society almost entirely, with their only purpose being to teach reading, writing, and the basics of how to learn. It argued that people should be allowed to educate themselves by honing in on their own interests and by being supported by peer networks. That fact alone shows Redmond is a creator who not only possessed a social conscience, but was also genuinely interested in society. This continues with Brookside, which explored themes associated with working class communities in Thatcher's Britain.
Where's all the jobs around here, eh? Where's the jobs around anywhere? There are none. That's why you're scared. That's why you want to go back in there and work in conditions that can kill you.
And had won acclaim with its Sheila Grant rape storyline. When compared with its soap rivals upon its airing in 1982, Coronation Street, Crossroads and Emmerdale, Brookside is remarkably different. The series earned huge critical acclaim as a soap which stood out for something, was unafraid to explore difficult social issues in a way that its contemporaries never could. Who better than Phil Redmond to save Emmerdale? Not only did he have a proven history of critically well-regarded works that stood out in their respective genres, one of which was a soap itself, but he'd previously been asked for advice from Julia Smith and Tony Holland in the early stages of the creation of EastEnders. Who better than a man who was fundamentally associated with gritty and hard-hitting and socially relevant television to turn around a soap that was anything but? Now a byword for irresistible TV mayhem, Redmond was called in by the ITV producers of Emmerdale in 1993 and asked if he could think of ways to invigorate the soap and increase the viewing figures. "Why, yes," he said. As a matter of fact, he could. Although our modern view of disasters in soap is shaped by moments like the Emmerdale plane crash and the 2010 Coronation Street tram crash, we shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that this is a modern addition to the genre. Before we get into examples, though, we need to be clear on what we mean when we talk about disasters. The dictionary definition gives a good overview, but in terms of what this means for soaps, we need to be just a little bit clearer. A disaster is a single moment which affects multiple people, even the community at large. The key point here is that it's a moment, not a series of moments. Characters like Richard Hillman and Archie Mitchell might have a similar impact on their community, but do so over a long period of time. Similarly, a character being killed in a car accident is not really a disaster. A coach overturning is. Disasters can be useful for soaps for a number of reasons. It's a big set piece that makes for good drama and brings in viewers. It has a huge ripple effect which can be used to set up future storylines. It allows writers to kill off the deadwood characters, and it allows for sets to be replaced. In terms of disasters in soap prior to the end of 1993, Coronation Street takes the lead and does so early. In 1961, only 2 months after it started airing, Coronation Street had a gas explosion which forced all the characters to take refuge in the mission hall, leading to them interacting and supporting one another in ways they otherwise wouldn't have done. The 1967 tram crash, certainly the most impressive disaster up until that point, killed Sonia Peters and threatened to kill Ina Sharples. Crossroads got in on the act in 1981, burning down the titular motel as a way to drum up interest in the departure of lead character Meg Mortimer, played by Noel Gordon. It also meant that they could replace the set with a brand new one, providing the audience with a good excuse for the refurbishment. This latter point was also one of the reasons behind the 1986 fire at the Rovers, allowing for it to be remodelled and the famous snug removed entirely, greatly opening up the location. A different pub fire, the 1992 Inferno at the Queen Vic, not only endangered the life of original character Sharon Watts, but also played an instrumental part in the collapse of her marriage to Grant Mitchell. Fundamentally, though, despite all the other reasons, disasters are just a good way of generating audience buzz. Fires and crashes and explosions aren't often seen on soaps, so we watch to see something impressive, a rare spectacle that only happens once every few years. The fact it's something that affects characters audiences have grown attached to, and who might well be household names, only increases the appeal. Disasters are a big and loud way of getting attention. It's not the sort of thing you can exploit too often, though. Disasters pre-1993 didn't have a lot of deaths and worked on a smaller scale. Part of this is due to logistical constraints. More importantly, however, was the fact that big disasters didn't fit in with the tone of soap operas at that time. It was one thing to have a few bruises and sprained wrists in a coach accident, quite another for something that would wipe out multiple characters in one fell swoop. Even today, while each soap has had large-scale disasters, it's not really the sort of thing you see more than once a year, if that. It's the law of diminishing returns, really. Drowning audiences in high-stakes disasters is a surefire way to be seen as needlessly overdramatic and explosive. It's a gimmick that works once every few years. The audience needs time to forget and fall back into the rhythm of normal soap life before you explode another bar or throw another tram at them. Looking at 1993, we can see a growing comfort with the idea of disasters in Emmerdale storylines. In 1977, 2 Swedish tourists got lost while potholing and had to be rescued before they drowned. 1982 saw a cattle stampede which left ruin in its wake. In 1988, there's a fire at Crosskill Farm which risks killing Annie Sugden. And in 1990, a chemical tanker crashed in the village. There's a clear escalation after 1986. Though we'd always had the occasional barn fire and the like, we're now getting more and more stunt work than ever before. I want to stress that Emmerdale, much like Coronation Street, had always had disasters, but they were small scale and fit with a rural aesthetic and farming tone. As time goes on, though, and Emmerdale makes an attempt to evolve and modernise, we see bigger disasters and more of them. Emmerdale was shredding its commitments to the tone Kevin Laffan had created when the soap started. It was a show growing more and more comfortable with the idea of disasters on a scale which would have been utterly inconceivable back in 1972. And the fact that ratings were falling and Emmerdale was struggling to stand out in a very strong field made disasters a very tempting proposition. By 1993, a massive disaster in Beckinsdale wasn't just possible, it was vital.
The only thing I was asked to do was save the show, right? And that was why it was such fantastic. I just had a complete blank check.
When Phil Redmond got the call, it came from high up in the Emmerdale production chain, no less a figure than John Fairley, the managing director of Yorkshire Tyne-Tees Television. Fairley cut right to the chase, laid out the cold hard facts of the situation, and asked Redmond if he would help.
He just called me up one day and said, you know, what did I think of Emmerdale and what would I do with it, you know? It's just kind of one of those strange questions. And yeah, I don't think he liked the first one, which was that, you know, scrap it and buy a new one for me, you know.
Redmond gave it serious thought. It wasn't as if he didn't have the time. Brookside was safely in the hands of producer Mal Young and was milking the famous Body Under the Patio storyline for everything it was worth. He was also acutely aware that there was more riding on this than just the future of Emmerdale. Yorkshire Television lost its flagship show, and the production company itself could be in serious trouble. As Redmond saw it, Emmerdale was their financial keystone. Take it out and the whole company would collapse, along with the lives and livelihood of everyone working there. The thing that really got Redmond interested, though, was the challenge. Could he do this? Could he take a soap that was on the precipice and breathe new life into it? It felt more like being asked to train a 20-year-old warhorse not only to run the Grand National, but to win it. The National, so I am told by those who know, is a race in a category of its own. It is not necessarily the best and fastest horse that wins, a combination of serendipity and stamina usually carries the day. Like the race itself, Johns challenged quite a few fences, jumps and ditches for me to fall at. The biggest concern was a personal one. Could I do it? If I didn't, the critics would have a field day, and the industry would be unforgiving, but it was too great a challenge to resist. Yes, I could do it. Redmond agreed to help, but not without a few conditions. Carlton had suggested a 3-month deadline. Redmond insisted on 12, and made it clear that he would need the same level of creative freedom he'd enjoyed with Brookside. Fairley agreed. You can have anything, Phil, whatever it takes, just fix it. With his decision made, Redmond now wanted to do a deep dive and see the reasons for Emmerdale's deathbed status himself. He asked for tapes and files to be delivered to his office so that he could have an exhaustive look at where the soap was. By his own account, it wasn't long before he was agreeing with the critics. One of the things Redmond focused in on immediately was the fact that the soap's unique selling point, the thing which made it distinct from all other British soaps, was being ignored. While Brookside, Coronation Street and EastEnders were all suburban, Emmerdale was rural-based. That was the point right from its conception. That was what made Emmerdale stand out. And now, Redmond felt, it was being disregarded entirely in favour of characters and storylines that would have fit in with any other soap. It was obvious to me that the folk running Emmerdale at the time had started watching what the other programmes were doing, rather than asking what their audience actually wanted and expected. By the time I got there, it was full of metropolitan issues, and everyone seemed to be intermarried or about to be. The acting also raised concerns, not because it was especially bad, but because it fell into a trap that many long-form scripted shows fell into, paying too much attention to the realities of television production. Redmond has an earlier chapter in his book criticising this. It's not so much a deliberate style of acting, so much as a rhythm their actors fall into. Post-production for television is time-consuming and limited, so mistakes might remain in the final cut. What emerged was an environment not limited to Emmerdale, but extending over long-form scripted television in general, and the result was television that felt stilted, unnatural, and unengaging. There was, he argues, always an atmosphere of restrained tension on set. Nobody wanted to make a wrong move in case they made a sound, cast a shadow, knocked a piece of equipment, or, as on Crossroads, made the scenery wobble. Actors were especially conscious of not slamming doors too hard to express anger, or overlapping their lines in case an important piece of dialogue was misunderstood. Having finished his research, Redmond next met with Emmerdale's writers, took the opportunity to get their appraisal of the situation. He asked them to give him a layout of Emmerdale's setting. He wanted to know where all the characters lived, where the landmarks were in relation to one another, how far it was from, say, Tate Farm to the Woolpack, and what paths led where. They had no idea. Well, alright, strictly speaking, that isn't entirely true. They could tell him where everything was in a production sense, how long the production team might take to get from place to place, but not the characters themselves. Redmond was aghast. Brookside Close had been planned out so that everyone working on it knew where every character lived. There was a geography about the place that made sense, and there were rules that had to be followed. Audience notice inconsistencies in their favourite shows because they are invested in a way that a writer never can be. You need a strict and established canon that makes sense and the world that feels real. You may have been writing a soap for 5 years, but a chunk of your audience has been watching it for 10, 20, 30 years or more. They will notice if something doesn't feel right, and then they'll struggle to get invested in your world. So that was the situation. A USP that was being ignored, an acting style that catered more to a smooth post-production than a sense of drama, and writers who had no real grasp of their world. How then could he fix it? Redmond's solution was a big event, the sort of thing that was guaranteed to draw in audiences and use that momentum to reshape and remodel the soap. He looked to examples in his own career. Grange Hill's Zammo drug storyline, 1985 Brookside Siege, but hit a stumbling block. Beckinsdale was rural and isolated.
A village out in the Dales, so it's got no big motorways, no railways where you could have a train crash. But what can happen is something actually literally falling out the sky.
In terms of finding something to make an impact, a plane crash works really well because it's the sort of thing you can't predict. It just happens. If Beckinsdale has a dam that burst or a train that derailed, it wouldn't hit as hard because those would be things audiences were already familiar with. But a plane crash would give no warning at all. Plus, it would be a good excuse for fire and explosions and inherently have a large death toll that wouldn't require decimating a small village in Yorkshire. Keith Richardson was shocked, to say the least, when Redmond told him that the best way to save Emmerdale was to drop a plane on it. £1 million price tag probably didn't help either. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures, and Redmond was going to be given everything he needed so that the soap might have the best possible fighting chance. With the approval of the powers that be, Redmond put together his dream team. 3 Brookside writers, Alan Swift, Andy Lynch, and Kathleen Potter, were melded with 2 long-term Emmerdale writers, Bill Lyons and David Joss Buckley, who together had working knowledge of the soap's entire history. Colin Cant, who had worked on Grange Hill, and Darryl Blake, who had worked on another Redmond project, Tucker's Luck, were brought on as well, and Ken Horn, who directed episodes of Brookside, would be responsible for directing the Crash episodes themselves. It's a team of people Redmond knew could be trusted to execute his vision appropriately, as well as a touch of the Emmerdale old guard to ensure that the end result fit with what fans expected. With the team built and Redmond backed to the hilt by the powers that be, it was time to build the vision. And on the 30th of December, the nation saw just what Emmerdale could be in the right hands.
Looks like a plane's come down on the village.
How bad is it?
No one knows yet, but it doesn't look good. This is just part of it.
We sort of lose sight of what an effective moment the Emmerdale plane crash is in its own right. After all these years, the moment has taken on an almost legendary status, but in doing so has become, in a strange sense, underrated. When the disaster strikes, it comes out of nowhere. The episodes leading up to the night of the crash play out like any other episode of the soap. As I said before, a plane crash in these circumstances doesn't need to be foreshadowed. Doing so would only lessen the impact. So we, despite knowing it's coming, are hit with a similar sense of shock to the characters, none of whom know what's going on.
Is that what it is, a gas explosion? I don't know, Alan, but whatever it is, it's big.
You don't think it's a nuclear attack, do you?
No, of course not. Who'd want to do such a thing in this day and age?
Suppose it's the county, the country. It could be war.
I'm sure it's not as serious as that.
You've just said yourself that you haven't got a clue what it is.
I doubt it's intentional, but it's a good parallel with how audiences felt about the plane crash in a meta sense. This terrible, inexplicable thing has happened that has forever changed the trajectory of these people's lives, and both characters and audience members are wondering how this happened to their quaint little village. The plane crash's impact is helped, in good part, by the fact that it contrasts so starkly with what came before. You could not have a more jarring contrast with the Emmerdale of old than this moment. This isn't a soap about farming now. This is an apocalyptic, chaotic fight for survival, where cars are abandoned in the street, the post office is broken into for medical supplies, everything seems to be on fire. It's not something that seems to be given much focus in discussions nowadays, but the plane crash episode of Emmerdale is genuinely harrowing. Right at the beginning of the disaster, jet fuel and fire rains from the sky, followed inexplicably by flowers, presumably falling from the hold, an image that is as bewildering as it is creepy. With her stables engulfed in flame, Kim Tate has to stand by and listen to the sound of her beloved horses burning to death while she is powerless to help. Residents looking for survivors find a field of dead bodies, and Alan Turner finds a singed airplane ticket. The Woolpack becomes a base for survivors to congregate and share concerns and looks as they reference people they've not seen in a while. The police turn the old school hall into a makeshift morgue, that timeless symbol of the English village now full of the dead. The next day, looters and sightseers, hoping to indulge themselves in the grim spectacle of the worst thing that has ever happened in these villagers' lives, have to be chased off, and Frank Tate finds a dead baby in a tree.
This isn't evidence. It's a baby. It's a baby.
And it's entitled to be laid to rest with a bit of dignity.
The directing is stellar. Beckinsale looks like Dante's Inferno. Flame and smoke and death as far as the eye can see. Those rolling hills we see in the introduction to every episode are burning, coated in the scattered remains of dead livestock and flaming debris. And the sky is dyed an oppressive red. It is utterly apocalyptic. The stunt work obviously deserves mention too. Richardson might have been a little concerned at the £1 million budget, but you can see every penny on screen. Zian Rowley, the special effects coordinator for the crash scene, says, "It was a question of thinking big. There were no restrictions about doing damage." Fraser Hines, who played Joe Sugden, has also highlighted the stunt work. The logistics were horrendous, it was feature film stuff, and these days it would win a BAFTA. Hines mentioned something important here. The stunt work is of a calibre that we'd never seen in soaps before. Again, we're used to it now. We've all seen the clips of the plane crash and everyone talking about how brilliant it was, etc, etc. But just imagine you're a regular viewer of Emmerdale and you go from this...
Right, Tim. If you and Alex can make sure that the lamb ewes are properly fed, we'll get on with putting the pens up. Okay?
to this. It must have been such a shock to the system. Though Redmond himself has said that the idea of the Emmerdale plane crash as a bloodbath isn't true, that 3 of the 4 actors who left decided to do so long before their characters were chosen to be killed, the disaster's death toll does look different when compared with those that came before it. For a start, it's a lot bigger. Even if we only count the 4 named characters that were killed off, Mark Hughes, Elizabeth Pollard, Archie Brooks and Leonard Kempinski, that's still higher than anything that came before. Once we add the 5 unnamed villagers and the 138 flight passengers, it gives us a total unlikely to be surpassed. As mentioned, we know some of these characters were going to be leaving anyway, but it's worth noting just who's killed and affected here. Mark and Len both have familial ties to the Sugdens. Mark is Joe's stepson and Len is married to Annie Sugden. In doing so, the main family of Emmerdale, the family that started everything, are among the worst affected by the disaster, with Annie herself falling into a coma as a result of the accident that kills Len. Elizabeth was the first wife of Eric Pollard. Much of her story leading up to the plane crash involved her knowing her husband was guilty of stealing from his employer but being unable to prove it. Her death leads to Eric being suspected of her murder, and though he didn't do it, the soap was able to get good mileage out of the idea that he might have. Even without this element of suspicion, Elizabeth's death is really well executed. We don't see her die as the intent is to create mystery, so instead we get Eric Pollard in this shattered fugue state desperate to find her. It's a classic disaster scenario, people wandering about asking strangers if they've happened to see their loved ones and clinging on to the faintest hope that somehow they avoided the inevitable. As a popular character who'd been on the show for more than a decade by this point, Archie Brooks' death has always struck me as particularly horrifying. He's vaporized, completely incinerated in front of his best friend. That's not hyperbole either, they never find a body. It's a very harsh fate for a long-serving character. It's unflinchingly brutal. Bill Redmond says that it was only a matter of seconds after the credits started that his phone rang. It was John Fairley. You did it. You actually did it. It's a bit early to know, John. Listen, I've been around this game long enough, and the French have a word for people like you. Do they? Yes, réalisateur, and you're one, worth every bloody penny. You've made all our New Year's happy. Fairley was right to be happy. Emmerdale's highest ratings came with the plane crash of 1993. 18 million tuned in to see the disaster. The figure remains the highest in Emmerdale's history. Not only that, but the reviews were positive too. Emmerdale seemed to have done the impossible and turned things around. The plane crash was more significant than just that one night. It had breathed new life into old characters. Kim and Frank Tate, having come so close to losing one another, reconcile and live happily ever after until they didn't.
What do you call this, Dave? Overtime?
The Sugdens unify over their losses. Chris Tate is paralysed, and his wife, Kathy, who had been planning to leave with her American wine merchant lover, remains with him out of pity. In the long run, Chris's accident gives the character a second life, the arrogant and self-assured businessman feeling humiliated by his new condition. Fan favourite character Betty Eagleton is introduced off the back of the disaster, and Emmerdale as a soap emerges with a new sense of community that it had lost. These aren't just people who happen to live near one another, but a supportive and tight-knit village. In practical terms, the disaster meant that Beckinsdale could be rebuilt, this time with an established geography. In 1998, production moved from the real working village of Esholt to a constructed set, giving the production crew a level of control they'd not had before. The episode's impact stretched beyond Emmerdale, though. Bill Redmond had just shown how far you could take a soap, not just in terms of the story the audience would accept, but also in terms of the scale that you could operate on. Not only could this size of spectacle be accomplished within the previously fairly narrow confines of a soap, but it could be enormously profitable if done right. As high-level computer-generated effects became more affordable in the early 2010s, the last stigma attached to doing disasters of this scale, the high price tag, faded away. Coronation Street's tram crash as part of its 50th anniversary episode led to a slew of copycats. We now live in a world where disasters of this scale are something we see every few years. More importantly though, the plane crash did what it was meant to do. It saved Emmerdale. As Kim Tate actress Claire King says, "We were always considered a lower pedestal than EastEnders and Corrie, so as much as people thought this is going to be OTT, it really did save Emmerdale's bacon. It wasn't just the fact that it boosted viewing ratings, it changed the entire trajectory of the soap."
We call it the banana moment, when Emmerdale kind of curveballed into, something that it is now.
That's a really good way to think about it. Emmerdale can essentially be divided into two main eras, BCP or ACP, before plane crash and after plane crash. Two very different soaps serving two very different purposes. One, a representation of rural life. The other, a modern British soap opera. Redmond's changes didn't stop there. His 12 months saw the introduction of the Dingles, certainly one of the soap's leading families, as well as the post office siege in June 1994. Redmond had wanted his tenure to end with another major disaster, envisaging a plague that forced the village into lockdown, with people clashing over restrictions and struggling to manage the fear of the situation. This time, though, Richardson was less keen, likely because he felt it was unnecessary at this point. Probably for the best, really. At any rate, Redmond got mileage out of the idea, using it for a Brookside storyline. His work was done, though. When Phil Redmond left Emmerdale, viewing figures were up 50% on what they had been before he joined, up an average of around 14 million. More importantly, though, there was actually a soap to view. By the time Kim Tate was crowned Queen of the Soap Bitches in 1995, Emmerdale had well and truly weathered the storm, and the new Emmerdale was secure. In a perfect bit of symbolism, the village's name was changed following the plane crash.
So Beckendale becomes Emmerdale.
That's right.
Should have called it Annie Sugdenvale.
Named in tribute to the farm where it had all started and which had been hit particularly hard during the crash. Emmerdale had been saved. Redmond had performed a miracle. The Warhorse had won the National. But it was not without its critics.
And it came straight down, and then this great mass of flames, and I turned to run, but there's nowhere to run to.
Good evening. Two hellish nightmares coming together in one terrible reality. That is the story of the Lockerbie disaster, of how death and destruction in the sky brought death and devastation on the ground below.
A little after 7 o'clock, on Wednesday the 21st of December, a bomb aboard Pan Am Flight 103 exploded above the quiet Scottish town of Lockerbie. All 259 people aboard the plane were killed, along with 11 residents of Lockerbie. It is impossible to discuss the Emmerdale plane crash without mentioning Lockerbie. Almost immediately after the disaster aired, comparisons were drawn between Emmerdale's fictional disaster and the real one which had happened in 1988. The argument was that Emmerdale's executives had essentially based the Beckinsale air disaster on Lockerbie, that airing it so close to the anniversary was tasteless in the extreme. ITV have always denied that Lockerbie influenced the storyline, arguing that any date they might have chosen would have been connected to some plane crash or other.
When we went through the calendar trying to find a date, that wouldn't cause offence, there's no month in the year where you wouldn't be causing some offence somewhere.
Redmond writes about this in his autobiography, saying that their researchers looked into it and found that, on average, there was a plane crash in the world once every 6 days, and that in 1993 alone there had already been 67, and that's without taking into account restricted military statistics. Redmond goes on to say that the main inspiration from the storyline came not from Lockerbie, but from a different plane crash, British Midland Flight 92, which crashed at Kegworth on the 8th of January 1989, a mere 18 days after the Lockerbie disaster, killing 47. British Midland flew in and out of Liverpool Airport. As the holder of a frequent flyer card, Redmond found it all too easy to imagine that he could have been on that flight. Having said that, even if the Emmerdale air crash was initially inspired by a completely different flight, and, as previously mentioned, was one of the few disasters made available to the production team after the setting's geography had removed the alternatives, we cannot escape the fate that the resulting episode looks very Lockerbie. Now, I don't think it was a case of the writing team and Redmond getting together and saying, let's do Lockerbie, but there are clear parallels, and I can't imagine Lockerbie wasn't mentioned, or at least in the minds of those making creative decisions. According to the Emmerdale Companion, the production company clearly did see the similarities, saying that Yorkshire Television had consulted groups concerned with Lockerbie, including the Friends of Flight 103. Lockerbie wasn't the only controversy, though, as this GMTV interview with actors Clive Hornby and Madeline Howard in early 1994 shows.
I do think it's a cynical, callous way of boosting ratings, and I think that Yorkshire Television will be judged accordingly by people. But such is television and such is life.
There are some takeaways from this. Lockerbie, of course, is mentioned, but also the fact that some viewed it as a shameless ratings gimmick. And I think the reactions from Hornby and Howard are interesting. It's hard to tell whether they're annoyed at having to field complaints about the storyline, or whether they share those complaints.
How does it go back to normality? How does that wee village and that soap go back to normality?
This is the point of the tragedy, really.
I think we all had certain worries, which we voiced at the original meeting. But we don't have any script controls.
There have been rumours that some of the cast were not pleased by the storyline. Certainly Madeline Howard's departure from Emmerdale only a few months later has been attributed to her disaffection with the change in tone and focus. Phil Redmond mentions a sense of discomfort when he first met with the writers, cast and crew, like they felt threatened by him. It's not difficult to see why. For a start, there were already rumours he was going to kill off characters, which means potential job losses. Secondly, the whole reason why he was there in the first place was because the show was under immediate threat of cancellation. Much like the atmosphere when Julie Goodyear returned to Coronation Street in 2002, there may well have been a feeling among the regular cast and crew that they were being told that they had failed, and now somebody else was coming in to fix their mess. It may also have been that they viewed their soap as special, different from the modern shows like Brookside and EastEnders that had murder and mayhem and salacious storylines. Redmond's arrival might have signalled to these people that they were about to lose something special, something they were proud to be a part of, that their show was now going to be forced to conform with all the other soaps for the sake of boosting ratings. In her 1988 book, Soapbox, The Paperback Guide to Soap Opera, TV critic Hilary Kingsley quoted then story editor Andrew Holden as saying, "There'll never be an outbreak of international terrorism, AIDS or race riots in Emmerdale Farm. We're not trying to shock or scandalise or be particularly relevant." This was the attitude of those in the writing room, and it was almost certainly the same for some of the cast themselves. The plane crash goes against everything that statement stands for, and frankly, I think it was a definite point of contention for many people involved in Emmerdale. For Redmond's part, he has said that, while things were awkward at first, the atmosphere soon changed. And he even mentioned that a couple of people came up to him and told that it was great that he was here and that it was about time something was done. He also goes out of his way in his autobiography to say that soaps like Emmerdale and Brookside don't belong to the creator or the writers, they belong to the fans. It's clear he cares about giving the fans what they want, and seems genuinely annoyed when writing about how Emmerdale writers weren't doing this. We should also remember that these changes didn't suddenly start with Redmond's arrival. They had begun 8 years previously in 1985. In fact, it was the changes in 85 that alienated the soap's creator, Kevin Lafan. As Kingsley says, Kevin Lafan bitterly rejects Emmerdale Farm. He hates its producers for including scenes of violence and explicit sex, and for compromising on the principles he set down for it. In August 1985, Lafan angrily accused Yorkshire Television of injecting the essentially ordinary, non-hysterical soap with increasing amounts of sex, sin and sensationalism. As vital as the Emmerdale plane crash is in the wider story of the soap, I think that to give Redmond all the credit or all of the blame would be more than a little unfair. His part in it was the tail end of a movement for change that had started years previously. I think it would be a little hypocritical to ignore that those previous changes in the 80s were regarded by many as massively controversial in and of themselves. Despite the criticism that exists, the Emmerdale plane crash was definitely worth it, completely saving the soap.
It turned the whole show around, and that's why we're still going again today. So thank you, Phil.
We lost some viewers, but we accrued so many more. It had the desired effect.
There's some parallel universe out there where Redmond wasn't called in and Emmerdale limps to its death within a year. I think the executives would have tried to save it, but I don't think they'd have been able to. It took someone like Redmond, someone who had a bit of contempt for the rules and liked pushing boundaries, to really come up with what was needed. Still, I appreciate where that criticism comes from. Emmerdale was very much its own thing, and it did stand out from the crowd. But I think it only really excelled in that right at the start. I like the quaint tone and the rural life angle as much as anyone, but the fact is that once the 80s hit, Emmerdale was totally outclassed by the competition. Yes, there was more going on than many think, and yes, it does deserve more consideration than people give it. But Emmerdale Farm was slow, and it wasn't particularly engaging. The only reason why it exists today is because Phil Redmond fancied a challenge. It's a strange irony, but it was the mind who brought us Brookside, arguably the complete antithesis of Emmerdale, that saved it. The nature of soap is change. Coronation Street today is not the same as Coronation Street was in 1960, or 1980, or 2000, and in 20 years' time it will look different still. Each soap impacts and affects the other. They're all products of each other's ideas and each other's successes, as well as a competitive TV environment which rewards the biggest and the loudest and the fastest. And in that story, there are a few moments quite as key as the Emmerdale plane crash. Hi all, thanks for watching. As you can probably tell, I think the Emmerdale plane crash is a really fascinating moment in soap history, not just for Emmerdale, but for the whole genre. I want to thank my Patreon supporters for their generosity. Names below, and I'll see you on the next one.